Despite covering a landmass the size of the United States, modern Chinese populations show surprisingly low genetic diversity. This suggests a common origin point, a single ancestral group that expanded quickly and recently. What caused this unusual pattern? And where did the ancestors of 1.4 billion people actually come from? Before we get there, subscribe. The answer rewrites everything we thought we knew about human history. In 2019, a team of geneticists at Fudan University in Shanghai set out to answer that exact question. They collected DNA samples from 11,670 people across every province in China. Then, they compared these genetic markers to every major ancient civilization on record. Egyptians, Mesopotamians, the Indus Valley, Mesoamericans, every single one. DNA does not lie. It carries mutation patterns that act like timestamps. When populations split, their DNA changes in measurable ways. The longer they stay separated, the more those differences build up. The results of the Fudan study came back. Only one ancient civilization matched. The implications of that match are about to flip everything you learned in history class upside down. This is not just about ancestry. This is about understanding how 1.4 billion people today carry genetic fingerprints from a single ancient source. And that source is not where most people think it is. Every human population outside Africa traces back to great migration waves. These waves left the continent between 50,000 and 70,000 years ago. Those early migrants spread across Asia, then Europe, and eventually the Americas. They met different environments along the way. Their bodies developed different adaptations. Their DNA slowly started to change. The Fudan team wanted to pinpoint a true origin. Which ancient civilization shared the most genetic markers with modern Chinese populations? Where did the ancestors of 1.4 billion people actually come from? They began their search with Egypt. Most people think of Egypt when they hear ancient civilization, pharaohs, pyramids, hieroglyphics, a society that thrived along the Nile for over 3,000 years. DNA samples from mummified remains showed specific haplogroups. These are genetic markers passed down through maternal and paternal lines. The comparison came back. Minimal overlap. Modern Chinese populations carried entirely different haplogroups. The genetic distance was too great. Whatever connected ancient Egypt to the rest of humanity did not create a direct line to modern China. The Fudan team then looked to Mesopotamia. This was the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It was the birthplace of writing, of agriculture, and of urban civilization. Genetic analysis of remains from Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian sites showed a distinct genetic profile. Again, there was minimal overlap. The haplogroups did not match. The mutation patterns were too different. Modern Chinese DNA did not show the markers you would expect if there had been significant ancestral mixing with Mesopotamian populations. The Indus Valley civilization was next. Geographically, it sits closer to China than Egypt or Mesopotamia. The cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwest India. This happened from roughly 3,300 to 1,300 BCE. If there was going to be a genetic connection, this seemed like the most likely candidate. The genetic comparison showed some overlap, but it was not enough to suggest a direct ancestral link. The haplogroups present in Indus Valley remains showed up in some modern Chinese populations, but only in trace amounts. Not enough to indicate a shared origin. It suggested occasional contact through trade routes. Haplogroup R1A, common in Indus Valley populations, showed up in less than 2% of modern Chinese samples. If there had been significant migration or mixing between these civilizations, the percentages would be much higher. The numbers told a clear story. These were separate populations that occasionally traded. They never merged genetically. The researchers moved on to the Americas. They looked at Mesoamerican civilizations like the Maya, the Aztec, and the Olmec. Those populations came from groups that crossed the Bering Land Bridge. This happened roughly 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. Their DNA should theoretically show some connection to Asian populations, since they originated from Siberian groups. The results matched that expectation. There were some shared haplogroups, but massive divergence. The genetic distance was consistent with populations that separated during the last ice age. They then evolved independently ever since. Haplogroup Q, dominant in Native American populations, appeared in modern Chinese DNA at rates below 1%. The separation was ancient and effectively complete. They also tested ancient Anatolian populations. These were the people who built Göbekli Tepe and founded some of the earliest agricultural societies. Again, minimal overlap. Haplogroup J, common in Anatolian remains, barely registered in Chinese samples. European Paleolithic hunter-gatherer populations showed similar results. Haplogroup 1, prevalent in early European populations, was virtually absent in modern Chinese DNA. The pattern held across every major ancient civilization outside East Asia. No genetic continuity, no ancestral link, no shared origin. None of the major ancient civilizations matched. The genetic markers were not there. The haplogroups did not line up. The mutation patterns showed separation, not connection. The mystery deepened. If none of the globally recognized ancient civilizations matched, where could the answer possibly lie? Then, something shifted. The Fudan team turned their attention to a different civilization, one that most history books ignore. They compared modern Chinese DNA to the Yellow River civilization, and everything changed. This ancient culture emerged about 7,000 years ago, deep in the northern plains of what is now China. You will not find pyramids or ziggurats here. This was not a civilization most people learn about in world history classes. The Yellow River people built with wood and earth. Most of their structures have long since turned to dust, yet archaeological digs at sites like Banpo and Jiangzhai revealed something extraordinary. These were not just simple farmers, they were true innovators. They crafted pottery with unique painted designs. They etched the earliest forms of Chinese characters onto oracle bones and turtle shells. Their villages were carefully planned, with circular houses arranged in neat patterns. This showed a sophisticated social organization. Their agriculture was based on foxtail millet and broomcorn millet. They domesticated these crops themselves, completely independent from the wheat and barley that grew in the Fertile Crescent. They were not copying Middle Eastern farming. They built their own food system, perfect for the Loess Plateau in northern China. Their DNA, however, did not decay. When the Fudan team matched genetic markers from these Yellow River archaeological sites against modern Chinese populations, the connection was undeniable. Y chromosome haplogroup 03, the most common Y chromosome marker in modern Chinese men, showed up in over 60% of the Yellow River remains. Mitochondrial DNA haplogroups M and D passed down through mothers, matched at similar rates. The genetic continuity was clear. Modern Chinese people were not descended from Egyptians, or Mesopotamians, or any other ancient civilization the Western world often talks about. The researchers did not stop there. They looked at tiny genetic variations called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. These are like individual letters in the DNA code where people can differ. By tracking these SNPs from the Yellow River people to modern populations, they could see exactly how much genetic change had happened over 7,000 years. The results were stunning. There was very little change. SNPs linked to things like lactose intolerance, common in the Yellow River people, appeared at almost the same rates in modern northern Chinese populations. Genetic markers for hair texture, eye shape, and skin pigmentation also matched. It was not just the haplogroups that matched. It was the fine-grained genetic details. The Yellow River is the source, but how did it become the foundation for 1.4 billion people? And what does this mean for our understanding of civilization? This genetic match was more than just finding a connection. It proved what historians had long suspected but could not confirm. Chinese civilization did not borrow its foundations from the West. It developed on its own. For over a century, Western anthropologists held onto a diffusionist model of civilization. This idea claimed complex societies only started in a few key places, like Mesopotamia or Egypt. From there, they spread out through conquest, trade, or migration. If you found a civilization with writing, farming, and cities, the thinking was that they learned these things from someone else. China never quite fit this model. Chinese writing looks nothing like cuneiform or hieroglyphics. Chinese farming grew up around millet and rice, not wheat and barley. Chinese metalworking, Chinese philosophy, Chinese statecraft, none of it looked like a system copied from somewhere else. The genetic evidence confirms what archaeology already hinted at. Chinese civilization was homegrown. It did not come from Egypt. It did not come from Mesopotamia. It came from the Yellow River, and it stayed remarkably genetically continuous for 7,000 years. But the Yellow River people did not just stay in one spot. Around 5,000 years ago, these populations started moving south. They brought millet farming with them. They carried their language, their tools, and their genes. When they reached the Yangtze River Basin, they met a different group. These were rice farmers who had lived there for thousands of years. These southern people had their own genetic makeup. They had distinct mitochondrial haplogroups, particularly variants of B and F, which were rare in Yellow River groups. Their Y chromosome patterns were also different. Haplogroup O1, common in the south, showed up much less often in the north. The Yangtze River civilization had been growing rice for at least 8,000 years. Sites like Hemudu show advanced wet rice farming, houses built on stilts over water, and jade carving traditions unique to the south. Their development was completely separate from the Yellow River people. The genetic data showed what happened next. Intermarriage and mixing occurred. Yellow River haplogroups spread south. They did not completely replace the southern populations. Instead, a blended genetic profile emerged. This blended profile shows up in modern southern Chinese populations today. It is predominantly Yellow River ancestry, but it has significant admixture from the original Yangtze rice farmers. These admixture rates varied by region. Populations in Zhejiang and Fujian show this clearly. These areas are right in the heart of the ancient Yangtze rice farming zone. They show 25 to 30% from the original southern populations. Further north, in Jiangsu and Anhui, the admixture drops. There, it is 15 to 20%. The gradient is clear. The closer a region is to the Yellow River heartland, the higher its Yellow River ancestry. But even in the far south, Yellow River ancestry dominates. Populations in Guangdong and Guangxi show 70 to 75% Yellow River ancestry. This is despite being over 1,600 kilometers from the original Yellow River sites. The expansion was thorough and persistent. This same pattern appeared again when Yellow River populations expanded west into what is now Sichuan and Tibet. Genetic markers showed up in Tibetan populations, but these markers were mixed with distinct highland haplogroups that were already present there. The expansion was real, but it wasn't a total replacement. It was integration. Tibetan populations show something unique. They carry the Yellow River haplogroups, but they also carry genetic variants for high-altitude adaptation. These do not appear in lowland Chinese populations. Variants in the EPAS, one gene, help with oxygen processing at high elevations. They show up at 80% frequency in Tibetans and are almost absent in Han Chinese populations. This tells us something important. When Yellow River populations moved into the Tibetan plateau, they mixed with groups already living at high altitude for thousands of years. Those highland groups contributed crucial genetic adaptations, which allowed the mixed population to thrive above 4,000 meters. Without that admixture, the expansion into Tibet might not have succeeded. By 3,000 years ago, the genetic profile of the people who would become the Han Chinese was essentially set. It was Yellow River ancestry, with varying degrees of admixture from southern and western populations. This genetic profile became remarkably stable. What forces allowed China to maintain such continuity compared to other regions like Europe, which experienced massive genetic upheaval? This genetic continuity is what makes the Fudan study so important. It shows incredible stability, documenting 7,000 years of genetic history. The same haplogroups, the same mutation patterns, the same genetic markers appear consistently. When scientists compared modern Chinese DNA to ancient DNA from 2,000, 3,000, even 5,000 years ago, the links were clear. They analyzed DNA from Han Dynasty tombs dating back 2,000 years. The genetic profiles were an almost exact match to modern northern Chinese populations. They found the same result looking at Shang Dynasty remains from 3,200 years ago. The genetic signature was stable across dynasties, wars, and political upheavals. Compare that to Europe. European populations show massive genetic upheaval over this same period. Steppe pastoralists from Central Asia swept into Europe about 5,000 years ago. They replaced up to 90% of the existing male population in some regions. These migrations created genetic gaps, making it impossible to draw a straight line from ancient European populations to modern ones. DNA from Bronze Age Britain shows huge replacement when the Bell Beaker culture arrived. The genetic profile shifted dramatically in just a few centuries. Modern Europeans are a genetic mosaic, layers of ancestry from different populations stacked on top of each other. Modern Chinese populations show continuity, stability. They have a single ancestral source that expanded and absorbed neighboring groups, but total genetic replacement never happened. Even the Mongol conquests barely registered. Geneticists can find Mongol ancestry in northern Chinese populations, but it is typically less than 2%. The Mongols ruled China for almost a century, yet they did not change the genetic makeup of the population. This raises an obvious question. Why? What kept Chinese populations so genetically stable when other parts of the world were constantly changing? Geography is a big part of the answer. The Yellow River Basin is surrounded by natural barriers, mountains to the west and south, deserts to the north, the Pacific Ocean to the east. These barriers did not make China unconquerable, but they did create a degree of isolation. This allowed a single population to dominate genetically. The Himalayas and Tibetan Plateau form an almost impenetrable barrier to the southwest. To the northwest, the Taklamakan and Gobi deserts created another barrier. The mountains of southwestern China are extremely rugged. They made large-scale migrations nearly impossible. These geographic barriers meant the Yellow River populations expanded mainly along river valleys and lowland corridors. That is where agriculture was possible. Agriculture was another key factor. Millet farming in the north and rice farming in the south supported dense populations. When you have dense agricultural populations, outside groups find it harder to displace them. The Yellow River Basin could support about 100 people per square kilometer during the Bronze Age. That was far higher than the steppe regions to the north, which could only support 1 to 2 people per square kilometer. When population density is that different, even successful military conquests do not lead to genetic replacement. There was a third factor: cultural continuity. Chinese civilization developed a writing system, a bureaucratic state, and a shared cultural identity. This persisted through dynastic changes. When the Mongols conquered China in the 13th century, they did not replace the Chinese genetically or culturally. They adopted Chinese administrative systems. They intermarried with Chinese elites. Within a few generations, their genetic contribution was absorbed into the existing population. The civil service examination system selected government officials based on knowledge of Confucian texts. It created strong incentives for non-Han elites to adopt Chinese culture. Mongol and Manchu aristocrats who wanted to participate in government had to learn Chinese. They had to master classical texts. They essentially became culturally Chinese. Their children intermarried with Han families. Their distinct genetic identity disappeared within a few generations. The writing system played a crucial role, too. Chinese characters remained consistent even as spoken dialects diverged. A person from northern China and a person from southern China might not understand each other's speech, but they could communicate in writing. This created a shared literate culture. It transcended regional differences and reinforced a common identity. The same thing happened with the Manchu conquest in the 17th century. Political control changed hands, but the underlying genetic and cultural continuity remained intact. The Qing emperors promoted Manchu identity and tried to keep Manchu and Han populations separate, but intermarriage was common, especially among the elite. By the end of the Qing dynasty, most Manchu families had significant Han ancestry. This stability also explains why Chinese civilization never experienced a true dark age like others. But what specific patterns did the study reveal about internal Chinese identity? This population stability also solves another historical puzzle. It explains why Chinese civilization never really had a true dark age. Egypt saw collapses, Mesopotamia broke apart. The Indus Valley civilization vanished completely. Rome fell. But China? It had dynastic changes, periods of division, then reunification. Yet the civilization itself never truly collapsed. Its writing system stayed, the farming base endured, genetic and cultural continuity held. This kind of stability creates resilience. It builds institutional memory. It makes a civilization that can absorb major shocks and keep going. The Fudan study also looked at Chinese subpopulations. Northern Chinese people showed the strongest genetic tie to the original Yellow River civilization. Southern populations had more mixing. This came from Yangtze rice farmers and earlier Southeast Asian groups. The data showed clear regional differences. For example, people from Henan, Shanxi, and Shanxi provinces, the Yellow River heartland, showed 85 to 90% Yellow River ancestry. These were direct descendants of the early millet farmers. They had very little mixing with other groups. move south to Hunan, Hubei, and Jiangxi, and that Yellow River ancestry drops to 70 to 75%. The other 25 to 30% came from Yangtze rice farmers and older southern groups. Western populations, especially in Sichuan and near the Tibetan Plateau, showed mixing with highland groups. Sichuan people have about 75% Yellow River ancestry. The rest comes from Tibetan highland groups, 15%, and earlier southwestern populations, 10%. But in every single case, the Yellow River genetic signature remained dominant. It was the core foundation that everything else blended with. This changes how we think about Chinese identity. The idea of a monolithic Han Chinese ethnicity is a political and cultural construct, but genetically it is more accurate to think of identity as a spectrum. This spectrum has a core Yellow River ancestry, then varying amounts of regional mixing, depending on where people lived and what happened in their history. Even with this variation, the genetic continuity is striking. A person from northern China and a person from southern China will have more genetic similarity to each other than a person from northern Europe and a person from southern Europe. That shows what 7,000 years of relative genetic stability looks like. This genetic thread is not just for people in China today. The Chinese diaspora populations that moved to Southeast Asia, Taiwan, and other places over centuries carry these same genetic markers. The Yellow River signature shows up in Chinese communities all over the world. It is a genetic line that connects 1.4 billion people to one ancestral source. The study also raised new questions. If the Yellow River civilization was the main ancestral source, what happened to other groups who lived in the region before 7,000 years ago? The genetic data suggests they were absorbed. The Yellow River expansion did not wipe out earlier populations. It integrated them. There was intermarriage, cultural blending, genetic mixing. Over thousands of years, the Yellow River genetic signature became dominant, but traces of earlier populations still exist in the DNA of modern Chinese people. This is different from Europe, where steppe migrations completely replaced earlier populations in some areas. In China, the expansion was slower, more gradual, and more about integration. The Fudan study proved something historians long suspected. Chinese civilization did not borrow its foundations from the West. This genetic evidence completely demolishes the old diffusionist model of civilization. It shows Chinese culture developed independently. Since 2019, other research teams have replicated and expanded the Fudan study. Every new study confirms the same finding. Modern Chinese populations trace back to the Yellow River civilization. There is minimal genetic input from other ancient civilizations. This changes how we think about human migration and how civilizations develop. It proves multiple complex societies can grow independently. They do not need to borrow from a single source. It also shows that genetic continuity over thousands of years is possible. This happens under the right conditions. Geography, farming, and strong culture can create populations that stay genetically stable. This happens even when empires rise and fall around them. So, when scientists compared Chinese DNA to every ancient civilization on record, only one matched. This was not some grand historical accident. Chinese civilization developed in place from a single ancestral group. It kept that genetic continuity for 7,000 years. This is not just a scientific discovery. It is a complete reframing of how we understand one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations. The DNA does not lie. The ancestors of 1.4 billion people were farming millet along the Yellow River 7,000 years ago. Their descendants are still there today. The Fudan study goes beyond just DNA markers. It reshapes what we think about human ingenuity and resilience. It shows us the diverse paths to civilization. It is a story of independent innovation and enduring cultural identity. For centuries, most history books focused on a single cradle of civilization in the Middle East. They assumed ideas and technologies spread out from there. This study gives us undeniable genetic proof of a parallel, equally ancient, and profoundly influential civilization. It developed completely on its own. This research explains the Chinese miracle. How did China stay so continuous through thousands of years? Through invasions, changing dynasties, and natural disasters? The answer lies in this genetic bedrock. A deeply rooted, stable population with shared ancestors gave an unmatched foundation. This led to cultural, social, and political resilience. The Yellow River civilization did not have huge stone temples or pyramids. Because of this, Western history often overlooked it. But the genetic evidence forces us to look again. It shows that complex societies can grow. They can develop their own agriculture, writing, and art. They can thrive even without grand stone structures. The Chinese example now serves as a powerful model. It helps us understand how other complex societies like those in Mesoamerica or the Andes also developed independently. Each had their own unique genetic and cultural paths. They were not just offshoots of a single origin. Human history is not a single thread spreading across the globe. The Fudan study reveals a rich tapestry. It is woven from many distinct and equally important origins. This new view makes our past richer. It celebrates the diverse genius of different peoples. For people of Chinese descent worldwide, this research offers a deeper connection. It links them to an ancient, unbroken lineage. This reinforces a sense of belonging and historical pride. It goes beyond modern political borders. It grounds their identity in a truly ancient and self-sufficient heritage. The Fudan study answered core questions, but it also opened new paths for research. Future studies will look deeper into specific regional mixing. They will examine genetic adaptations to China's diverse environments. They will also pinpoint the timing and ways culture spread within China. The story of the Yellow River civilization, told through its DNA, shows the enduring power of place. It proves the strength of an ancestral line. It highlights humanity's capacity to forge its own path, independently and brilliantly. It reminds us that history is often more complex, more diverse, and far more fascinating than we first imagined. If this kind of deep dive into ancient history and human origins is something you want more of, subscribe and tell me in the comments, what other ancient civilization do you think deserves a closer look through the lens of modern genetics?